I'm going to present in this video my own comments in the Honey Badger Radio episode, You're Just Feminism for Men. My intent was to talk about the use of the phrase to dismiss recognition of men's victimhood, but not by feminists, but by neutral men, and by victimhood, I mean victimhood. I originally was going to title this Better Whipped Than Weak, but decided against it. This episode is about men preferring to continue to be victimized rather than being seen as a victim. On The Future of Men's Rights, Kijiji Allen writes, "We need to leave men's rights behind. Men will always die for a cause, and that cause isn't men's rights. Society just doesn't care about me, and I like it that way. So many smart people in this sphere wasting their time with pity. And thanks for your concern, Allison, but I'd rather have you whip me than cry for me." On Rand Zerker 65, How Feminists Are We? Palace of Wisdom writes, "Victimhood is exactly one use, to demand more than your due in the name of justice. Men are not interested in getting others to hand us free stuff. We're not interested in keeping score. We don't want to wallow in self-pity. We don't want to use the tactic of women or children. Women want to be treated fairly, not told, 'Oh, you poor thing.' You may never understand that, but you need to accept it." And on The Future of Men's Rights, William Barrick writes, "One thing is for sure, I will never help someone who sees me as a victim. I see myself as a fighter, not as a victim. Even when I lose, I still see myself as a fighter, not a victim. If you see me as a victim, then I will see you as a condescending, if not patronizing person, and I won't help you." If we get accused of being feminism for men because we bring attention to the issues men face as men. Ignored sexual and domestic violence, suicide, workplace deaths and injuries, selective service, disposable fatherhood. The list of ways men are rendered helpless by our society is long and painful. However, we're not selling victimhood to men. We're not manufacturing victimhood for men. We are recognizing where society has victimized men because they are men. We are saying men have been wronged. We are also saying we can't fix a wrong until we recognize it. When some men tell us they don't want to be seen as victims, that's fine. But what about other men? What about boys? What about the negative effects on women and girls? When I listen to this, I can't help but imagine a powerful knight who's bested and injured by her microphone. When I listen to this, I can't help but imagine a powerful knight who's bested and injured by a dragon. And that knight insists there's no such thing as dragons, because to admit there was, or are, would be to admit that he was bested and wounded. He was made a victim. But even while the countryside is being laid to waste by the dragon and the knight, he refuses to acknowledge, much less fight, or help others fight, or even tell them what's going on, why their daughters are kidnapped and their shepherd sons baked black and half-eaten, for fear of acknowledging the beast that bested him. When you're tempted as a man to say things like, "I'd rather be whipped than seen as a victim," maybe you should consider that it isn't all about you. Maybe you're in a position where whatever interpretations you're facing are worth the cost of maintaining an identity of strength, but not everyone is. And also, have you considered that if you prefer being victimized to being seen as a victim, if you prefer being whipped to being seen as weak, that's exactly what feminism offers men. Feminism whips men, blames men, but it certainly doesn't see them as weak or victimized. Feminism exploits men's willingness to be whipped as long as they aren't seen as a victim. In that sense, I'd say, in challenging both the whipping and the fear of being seen as a victim, I'd say we're the exact opposite of whatever feminism is, and the exact opposite of whatever feminism offers men. Happy Drumstick 93. Actually, I have a question for Allison. What have you done for the men's rights movement? I've been talking about and refining the arguments thinking about these issues since I started on Our Men's Rights Usenet in 2003. At the risk of sounding arrogant, a modest portion of the arguments and political thinking underpinning men's rights and gender dynamics is original to me. This includes my work on threat narratives. I have extreme anxiety and depression due to post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of having lived through bombing in the Gulf War, among other things, extreme enough that I have been hospitalized and undergone emergency psychotherapy to prevent suicide. When I was called upon to talk in public about men's issues, I set aside my fear, and I did it. I did it under my real name and on television, permanently tying myself and my reputation to men's rights. Prior to going on TV, I was experiencing panic attacks, which I managed to calm using a technique based on cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm sure I look like a lunatic. In 2015, I spoke out for Gamergate and men's rights at a convention which represented the largest marketplace and networking opportunities for artists and creatives in the Western Canadian prairies. It was a marketplace in which I had expected to be able to sell my wares for years, and in the previous year I had been offered a job. Because of my public stance for men's rights, I was kicked out of that marketplace and banned for a period of 10 years. Due to their updated policies, I'm now basically banned for life. I've tried to do what I can to advance knowledge of this topic for 13 years now, and this is what I've seen. Watching everything in this movement in that amount of time. I've watched increasingly draconian legislation regarding sexual consent being passed year after year, and watched opposition to this process fail year after year. I've watched on-the-ground men's rights activist groups form, be active for a few years, achieve a few years of agitation, and then break apart or drift away. I've watched one legislative effort to instate shared custody fail. I've watched appeals against fraudulent restraining orders for the inanity of family courts fail. I've seen one or two situations where a judge was finally held accountable for perverting the course of justice by removing or tampering with exculpatory evidence from a trial, and then watched as they were given a slap on the wrist or reprimanded to a class on ethics. I've watched petitions fail. I've watched the media invent a narrative out of whole cloth to smear a consumer revolt, libeling an entire group of people with lies. I've seen the media demonize and libel people left, right, and center with no recourse, with their victims having no recourse against their bullying and their lies. I've watched a man break his heart trying to keep a crisis line, then a shelter alive for 20 years, only to kill himself when he lost it. I've watched all of it, and what I've done is figure out or recognize what doesn't work. Or rather, it's not even something I've done, it's just something I've noticed. What's been tried is appealing to media, to government, to academia, protest petitions, proposing legislation. They've all been tried. I'm saying what hasn't been tried is just fucking building what we want to see ourselves. I don't mean the shelters and helplines. I mean building the society that funds the shelters and helplines, whatever form that helping men takes. Now, when I say that petitions, legislative changes, and appealing to media have failed, do not believe for a second that I'm saying nobody should do it. You should. We all should. Just realize that when they fail to have the effect you want in this old society, that they are helping to build a new society of people who care and who are passionate and motivated. That's what's going to create real change. Building a society of people bound together by an infrastructure who care about sustainable compassion for both men and women. I also think we can do more to build a society that cares about sustainable compassion for men and women. One part of that is to start to somehow spark compassion between high-achieving and vulnerable men in order to get anywhere with funding. We focus a lot on building shelters and support lines based on the talk therapy model for abused men. In fact, if you think about it, most of the agitation around services for men is based on the feminist model of services for women. I'd like to call the feminist approach to helping women the victimhood brothel model. It works because large groups of vulnerable women are political weapons that justify social policy and drum up donation dollars. Every woman frozen in a state of perpetual victimhood offers a return to the corporations and government who cage and feed her. But the same can't be said for male victims. They don't provide a return in moral legitimacy. In fact, you could say the opposite. In serving male victims, corporations and governments risk being seen as morally illegitimate, with cries of, "Why are you taking away from women to give to those lazy bums?" I'd like to propose that there are more men being hurt by our society than just the ones who are at most risk. The homeless, men who have no shelter when they're subject to domestic violence. And when we focus on the obvious cases in which men are in acute need, we might miss a possible solution to helping all men. Kira says, yes, most successful men who have gained their success by outdroning the other drones. They are very well aware that if they rock the boat too much, chances are that it isn't going to end well. They know that between them and that homeless guy in the street are their career, their social standing, their bank account, and that's more or less it. There seems to be two twin wrongs that are done to men. The first is to treat them like their only worth is their work, and the second is to give them no way of feeling valuable through their efforts. The achieving man fears being valued only for his achievement. The unachieving man fears being a burden. Most men, in my experience, have had the experience of working hard and then still being thrown away out of convenience. It's not just the work, because many men work hard and are still disposable. High-achieving men are contemptuous of vulnerable men because they want those men's vulnerability to be a result of their own lack of initiative and potential, rather than having been treated as expendable. Because high-achieving men have a wound as well, and that wound is the fear that no matter how much they achieve, they are still disposable. They can be thrown away at any point. That the only thing that stands between them and the homeless man is their career, their achievement, and their bank account. It's easier to scapegoat vulnerable men for somehow being lesser or flawed than it is to recognize the truth. Society values men's work and treats man like the wrapper for the work. Colin Clyde says, "I wish I had an older men's rights activist to mentor me when I was younger. I went through hell on earth in my 20s. Not only do we need to extend our concept of supporting men from acute cases to men who are the walking wounded, the high achievers who have internalized the idea that the man is just the wrapper for the work, we need to look at how men and women value themselves differently. When women receive resources, they feel valued. When men receive resources for nothing, they feel like a burden. And feeling like a burden is deadly for men. It's what prompts many men to contemplate, attempt, or succeed at taking their own lives. To a certain degree, we should probably work on helping men to give themselves a break about being a burden. Sometimes you just got to take a load off. But overall, can we really expect men to receive the help they need if it comes with seeing themselves as a burden on others? Should we just say to men, the right way to get assistance is the feminine way? Or should we develop a method of helping men that recognizes how they see themselves and how they wish to be helped? I think you know my answer to that. When I was walking through my town a couple days ago, I noticed two men on an open grassy space just to one side of the main street. Parked in the grass was a truck with a loading ramp, and they were talking excitedly in front of an all-terrain vehicle. One of the men, and they were both fairly young, said to the other with what my husband describes as an enormous Jack Nicholson grin, "I have big plans for you. I have big plans for you." We didn't catch the rest of the conversation. Were the plans about his friend driving the ATV, the all-terrain vehicle, in a race, or something they were planning to build together, a company, a house? Don't know. But this is an example of something that I have noticed. I noticed that men have a natural instinct to mentor each other. It's an obvious pleasure, not a sexual pleasure, but an instinctive one, where one man assists another in achieving his full potential. And if you look at even the studies into pheromones, apparently men have pheromonal receptors and signals that induce cooperation in each other. And the effect is stronger the more testosterone a man has. So you men are actually signaling and inciting cooperation out of other men. And I always find that interesting that it's the guys with lots of testosterone that do this more than the ones with low testosterone. I might explain a few things in our social landscape, but I digress. And in turn, the man being so mentored or having their skills utilized in the other's plan accepts it as a form of caring. I don't know if women understand this because I don't know if there are many women who experience it. Feminists try to break this apart, this instinctive urge in men. They call it a boys' club. This instinctive urge to mentor each other, to use each other's potential, and to submit to that use as a form of caring. Because to be frank, I think they're jealous of it. Or maybe they just see it through feminine eyes. Being used in someone else's plan, being valued for your use is exploitation. Not a form of caring or compassion, not a form of recognition of worth, it's exploitation. Women will protect each other when they're victims, but tear each other to pieces when it comes to achievement. Men will not protect each other when they're victims, but they will, to a far greater degree, take pleasure in mentoring or utilizing each other's potential, or being mentored or utilized. I've seen this in my own life. I've seen a man go from being uncertain and self-doubting to a man who tolerated people using him, to being confident and bold and assertive just because he was valued for his potential, and someone took the time to tell him so and cultivate it. For men, we may need an approach to rehabilitation and support completely different. Not just shovel resources into them, but see their potential and heal their feelings of being a burden. Instead of putting achieving and vulnerable men in opposition like our society does, put them to work creating a society, a community, a civilization that values both. And let me just get into that a bit. Vulnerable men, if you look at it with a certain set of eyes, are actually balls of potential. They're the men who don't function in our society. They're the ones who illustrate society's flaws and dysfunction. But they're also the ones who point to the new. Let me explain. Let's imagine you're a high-achieving fish. You can swim deeper and faster and leap higher out of the water than any other fish. You're like a flash of silver lightning in the deep, and you take pride in being the best, the very best fish. And yet one day, as you're leaping from the water, as you slip through the air, feeling the lack of drag but a strange weight in your muscles, the air harsh against your gills, the sun beating on your scales, there's an entire world. You realize there's an entire world, an entire universe that's closed off from you, that you can't access. You might be cheered for your prowess by the other fish when you slip back under the waves, but at that moment, you realize that there's an entire world out there, and that realization nags at you like a parasite that's wiggled its way under your scales. You might start your obsessive need to conquer that new world with the fastest swimmers, the deepest divers, the highest leapers, but your entreaties may fall on deaf ears. They're quite content with their achievements. In fact, they may be angered at you for suggesting there's a world out there that makes their achievements meaningless in the face of its wide, bright, and harsh beauty. And if they do try, they find that what makes them so exceptional as a fish makes them completely unsuited as what can you call this new way of living? It has no name yet. And then you realize, one day as a high-achieving fish, that you're looking in the wrong place. It's not the fish that are the best at being a fish you need. It's the fish that are the worst at being a fish. So you find them. The ones that are plodding because their fins are overly stubby and thick. The ones that can't dive deep because they need the greater oxygen at the surface. And as a high-achieving fish, you find them and you see what they can do.